As I said, our schedule for today calls for us to look at the first 3 or 4 chapters of the book. And as we talk about that, of course, these are fairly long chapters, and we are going to have to just spot some things as we go along. Most of you in this class here know the stories, and so it's possible for us to move right along without too many having to read the whole text. We'll read what we need to as we go, and the rest of it we'll read ourselves as we think about it and look at these texts. Remember, last week we said that while these 5 books of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the books of Moses, they're sometimes called, while they provide us with history, they're not history for history's sake. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand me about that. The Israelites were very concerned about their history and their legacy with each generation as they went along. They were concerned for good reasons about some of their history because their genealogies were important to the assignment of properties and other things in the land. So there are good reasons for the history that we have recorded, but the purpose, the real purpose of the histories and the focus of the history in each case has to do with the establishment and the maintenance of their faith in God and their relationship with the Lord, and then to set forth the directives that He has given for their moral values and their ethical requirements as God's people, and to be like Him. So let's not forget that. We'll keep that in our focus. There are 3 main themes in the book of Exodus that we want to watch. We'll call them liberation, their deliverance, the Exodus itself from Egypt, identification as God's people. They are identified as a nation when God gives them national law there at Mount Sinai, and they're separated from all other peoples by the covenant that God has with them, beginning with Abraham and including then this law that He gives to Moses. The 10 Commandments are the focus in the book of Exodus, with about 4 chapters of personal laws that follow the 10 Commandments, in addition then to the rest of the book, which is the sanctification of the people. They're being set apart to God, and that signified by the construction of the tabernacle and the establishment of the priesthood, the special priesthood, and all those things that are associated with the priesthood. So that's kind of how you break down the outline of the book of Exodus: liberation, identification, we'll call it, and sanctification. Those 3 words maybe we can remember as we look at the book. And the chapters are given to you on this little outline. very clearly. Okay? Let's remember our sons of the patriarchs who become patriarchs themselves. These are the names. Do you remember that? We said that was the opening line of the book, and that's the title that the Jews often used for the book. These are the names, and then these names appear in the text right in the beginning. So we've got our 12 sons of Jacob, who are the fathers of the 12 tribes. We'll have some little odd change where Ephraim and Manasseh are given the double portion at the end. It's a little bit like when you try to learn the apostles and you get the 12 and then you have Paul added. So here we have Manasseh and Ephraim with the 12 sons. And just an interesting sideline. So who are they? Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, Issachar and Zebulun, Joseph and Benjamin. You got it? Everybody? Okay. Get it in your mind. It'll be very important to some of our later studies when we talk about the invasion of the land and the division of the tribes, the tribal lands coming a little later. And those tribal lands will be named for the patriarchs that are these sons, actually. So let's not forget all of that. These are the names, the sons of Jacob. Now, they went down into Egypt, 70 of them, and then Joseph and his wife were already there. But there were 70, basically, who started the development of the people of Israel. And this is going to grow up as a nation in Egypt. And that is very interesting. Probably they will be down there about 215 years. We will look at, when we get a little later on, we're going to have some numbers like 400 and 430, right, guys? And we'll maybe one day take a look at that. Probably that is from the, as Paul says in Galatians, what chapter is it? 3, Galatians 3. He speaks of 430 years from the time of the covenant to the time of the Exodus, probably including from the time that God made the agreement with Abraham or made the promises to Abraham till they exited was 430 years. That's a long time for us. But they're going to multiply. Look at the way Moses puts it in Exodus 1. He says the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. The land there is probably Goshen, the area where they were placed when they went down into Egypt. Do you remember Goshen? They fixed it for you. Ray had a little problem with the pointer Wednesday night, so it wasn't working, was it? No, well, it is now. So they were placed apparently up in this area right here. The capital of Egypt in this period of time, where the Pharaoh was, had his palace, was probably at Memphis. It's thought to be at Memphis. That's not Tennessee. Memphis is not even the capital of Tennessee, for those of you that. So, but now they're going to build a city up here for the Pharaoh, and it's called Ramses. It is thought that our Pharaoh at this time is probably Ramses II, but that's questionable, and different things you read will say different names for who the Pharaoh is. But here, I'll get to that in a minute. Let's go back here. They multiplied, grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. The land probably is not all of Egypt, but probably is this area of Goshen where they were assigned to live, the delta region of Egypt. You can see it up there. Okay? We'll come back to this map off and on as we go. Now, Goshen was a strategic region for the defense against invasion. Do you see that? The invasions from the east, like with the Assyrians when they came down against the Egyptians, or the Babylonians, and you see Canaan up there. Well, Israel, that's Israel's land, that they would come through there to Egypt. The eastern kingdoms or empires would send their soldiers through, and they would come across that area. Whoop, boy, that's not good. There we go. There we go. Now, see, they would come in this way, and Goshen is right in here where they would be traveling, you see. So Goshen is a strategic area for defense against invasion. It was not going to be the permanent home of the Israelites. And we need to remember that, because God had already said that they would be given a land. This was not it. See, the promise to Abraham was that he would have a land, and that was up in Canaan. It was not down in Egypt. Jacob, when he died at the end of the book of Genesis, was carried back to Machpelah, back near Hebron. You remember that? And Joseph made them promise when he died that they would carry him out with them and take him back to his land. Joseph is buried in Ephraim, isn't he? Am I remembering that right, Matt? Do you remember? I think he was buried in Ephraim. But at any rate, when they go out, this is interesting, we'll see this when the Exodus takes place. When they go out of Egypt, they're carrying his mummy case. with Joseph's body in it. Okay? That must have been an interesting sight when you crossed the Red Sea, you think? Okay. The new Pharaoh, the text says now, see, they multiplied and they really grow, and then this new Pharaoh comes in. And this new Pharaoh over Egypt, he did not know Joseph. In other words, he didn't know the history. That has made historians kind of focus on a period of time around the 13th to 15th centuries in Egypt's history, secular history, where the Hyksos people from the north came in and ruled Egypt for a couple of 100 years. And it is thought that this Pharaoh may have been one of those Hyksos rulers who just didn't know the history and was ruling in the country. So I don't know how important that is to you at this point, but it might explain why there is this lack of understanding of the Israelites, whereas Joseph had been clear to make them know that before. Incidentally, the word Pharaoh now means great house. Like we would talk about the White House, the great house was the palace and the grounds of the Egyptian rulers. Yeah. Sometimes it refers to the dynasty, and it came to refer to the king himself. It kind of went through a progression, but the name Pharaoh originally meant great house and referred to the White House, we would call it in our country. See, okay? The Israelite slaves were used to build 2 supply cities up in Goshen. And the text, what I want to get to here now is the text says this was with rigor, is the word that my New King James Version uses. Really hard labor they would have. They had to make bricks out of mud, and they had to carry all of this heavy material to the place where they were building. And they built big walls and big buildings in these cities, and it was hard work. You can imagine it's hot down in Egypt. It's not a very pleasant place to have to do all of that kind of work. And as they go along, Pharaoh, the note here says, used draconian measures to limit their growth and their resistance to this slavery that they had. So there are stories in some of the secular literature of Egypt and in their legends about references to different kinds of toil that they put these people under and different kinds of punishment that they suffered in this time. They were often beaten if they didn't carry out their responsibilities, and they were really slaves, just hard slaves that you want to remember. Degrading, brutal, work gangs. They're not compensated for what they do. They're just forced into civil positions of hard labor. This probably refers to the men. The women probably also suffered hardship with the agricultural needs they would have to get their food and so on as we went along. So tough, tough times. And this slavery became a kind of a national symbolic thing to the Israelites, and it was recalled over and over again in their history as the prophets, for example, refer back to the slavery of the Israelites in Egypt and warn them of the coming of the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or something. Okay. It's identified in the text, the oppression of this is identified in the text with their brick making. And you remember the story in the text. How does it go? Remember?
They used to have material provided to them. Now they have to gather it all.
All right. That's the way it's presented in the text, isn't it? They had the straw, is what they're referring to particularly, and the straw was mixed with the mud and then shaped and then carried to be placed after it was dried. Usually it had to be dried 3 or 4 days before they could move it after they shaped it. And so the brick making is kind of used as the example of the measures that they were using to control the Israelites in this severe bondage that they were in. The slavery involved building entire cities, working the fields for grain to export even. And the Egyptians were one of the major exporters of grain, even up into the New Testament times. We read about that biblically. Paul apparently rode ships that were grain ships out of Egypt. You remember these references in the book of Acts to his travels by ship? Remember that? Remember this? Are y'all with me? And so Egypt was a big exporter of grain, but they had to maintain irrigation for that because of the long, hot seasons of the year. They had to irrigate by forming canals and all out of the Nile River. And they had to work those canals so that the water kept coming to water their crops, provide the moisture they needed to get. See, they had to do all of that as they went along. So we need, I think, not to pass over that first chapter or two of Exodus as we look at this, because it sets the stage for the Israelites to feel the great oppression and hard labor that the Egyptians put them to as they went, you see. Mud mortar for the most part on the brick making, some stone for quarries, from their quarries for the temples, for pyramids, for funeral monuments, for the gateways into the city areas. They had some stone, but the biggest part of their obligation to work involved the brick making, you see. And that's in your text as you read. So my point is, let's just read over that. Let's try to feel what those Israelites felt with that kind of slavery that they were under. Okay? Now, let's jump ahead a little bit. We go down, where is it? About verse 12, it starts about the oppression of the Pharaoh with trying to limit the birth of male children among the Israelites. So, Hebrew midwives, that was an honorable profession, apparently. It appears that there was some professionalism about the midwives. They're mentioned, for example, in Genesis 35. There's a midwife with Rachel. In 38, there's a midwife with Tamar. You'll notice these in the text. They're mentioned in the text. So that gives cause then when Shiphrah and Puah are named for you to think there was some recognition of who would be the midwives. They would be more like birthing nurses, I guess we'd say, or take the place of what you'd hope would be a doctor. What they would do is maybe mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 16. If you remember this verse, it says, as for your nativity, and of course he's comparing the national thing to a birth. And he says, on the day you were born, your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed in water to cleanse you. You were not rubbed with salt. Apparently they did that in the cleansing of the baby. I don't know if we'd want to do that now. Or swathed in swaddling clothes. Those were just some of the things that were done when a child was born. Some have suggested that these two women that are named may have been leaders of groups of midwives. I don't know. They may have just been the two women that were in this situation that we're talking about in the text. Anyway, you can think about that. They're told to kill all the male babies during the birth process. And the text, I'll just mention this, the text mentions the birth stools, which is kind of an interesting thing. Apparently, the women were more upright in the delivery of the babies. But now, if you're thinking of a woman giving birth on a stool like that, that would accommodate these midwives doing something to the child, killing it when it came forth. So that may be why we have some of this mentioned, because they're told, the midwives are told to kill the male babies. Which reminds you of Herod and the Bethlehem scene later, isn't it? A lot of comparisons, incidentally, when you look at what happened with the Israelites down there in Egypt to some of this. Where did they take Jesus after his birth to avoid his death by Herod? To Egypt, isn't it? They take him to Egypt to escape the death. So lots of little things you might sometime, if you don't have anything to do, instead of working a crossword puzzle, you might sit down with your Bible and just go through and pick out things that remind you of later things in these books. Well, they feared God. The midwives feared God and didn't kill those babies like they were told to do. So this is sometimes called the first case of civil disobedience in the Bible, which is a kind of an interesting thought, I guess. They responded to Pharaoh that the women of Egypt gave birth, or the Israelite women, Hebrew women, gave birth before the midwives got there. That was their excuse for not killing the little babies, you see. It's just kind of interesting. So God provided, the last verse of chapter 1 says that God provided households for the faithful midwives. So God took care of them, which is a nice comment, isn't it? And a blessing from the Lord. So what did the Pharaoh do then? If they wouldn't kill them in the process of birth, what do you do? Throw them in the river. So, are you getting the picture of how severe this oppression was in Egypt? That's the point, I think, of that whole first chapter. Okay? Now we're introduced to Moses in chapter 2. Moses, literally the word comes from some Hebrew letters that probably suggest the idea of being drawn out. In fact, the text says, because I drew him out of the water. So he is hidden in an ark of bulrushes. This ark, incidentally, the word ark is used here, same word that's used with Noah's ark. Kind of interesting, and apparently not used anywhere else. So he is saved by water in the edge of the river in an ark. You think that harks back to anything? Noah and the flood. The salvation of a good one. Noah, and Moses? Just a thought, okay? Now, we are told that Moses' parents are Israelites. They're Levites. They're out of the tribe of Levi. And we want to remember that. That becomes important a little later on because Moses' brother, Aaron, will be the father of the priesthood. So they'll be Levitic and they will be Aaronic. They will be of Levi and of Aaron of the Levites. Okay? So his parents are not named early on. They're named over in chapter 6. Their names are Amram and Jochebed. And they're common people, kind of like Mary and Joseph. Common people. That's a comparison you might make with whom? With who? Joseph and Mary and Jesus. Jesus and Moses. Okay? Okay. So his sister now is Miriam. And she's named a little later too. She watched for Moses. When the princess comes, she is the suggested nurse for Moses. And the irony in the text, as you see it here, is that Pharaoh's daughter paid, she says, I will pay you to be his nurse to Moses' mother. So the interesting how Miriam gets the mother, unbeknownst, I suppose, to Pharaoh's daughter. Okay? Now, Pharaoh's daughter is one of these unnamed girls. We'll come back to this. Pharaoh's daughter has maidens. If the father was Ramses II, we are told in some of the Egyptian literature that she was one of 59 daughters to Ramses. That's kind of interesting to me. Would this whole series of events been somewhat maybe not recognized by Pharaoh when he had this many daughters and all? Do you think? That's kind of interesting to me, what the dynamics of this would be in terms of Pharaoh's knowing what's going on. I mean, if he ordered all the babies killed, why would he let Moses come into the palace? Maybe he doesn't even know what's going on that way, in that kind of a multiplied situation. You might say, well, how do you have 59 daughters? Well, when you read Judges and the book of Kings, who was it? Gideon had 60 sons or something like that, didn't he? 70 sons? How many did Gideon have? Rehoboam is said to have the most children numbered in the Bible. He had 60 daughters and 22 sons or 28 sons or something like that. So they had harems and they had lots of children, lots of wives in those periods of time. Okay? Well, she was walking by the Nile and one of its tributaries coming to bathe. And she saw the ark, the basket, and she sent her maid to retrieve it. An ark was not a sailing vessel. It didn't have any steering gear, no steersman, dependent upon God for its well-being, like the ark of Noah. And so she put this in the river. What happened to the rest of the maidens? I thought I'd read you this from the Midrash. Now, these are Jewish rabbis speculating about why all these maidens didn't reveal. How did she get away with all this, is where this is coming from. When her handmaidens saw that Pharaoh's daughter wished to save Moses, they said to her, Our Lady, in the world's practice, when a king issues a decree, even if the whole world does not obey it, his own children and the members of his household do obey it. Yet you would violate your father's decree. So they're warning her, the rabbi says. At that, the angel Gabriel came down and smote them to the ground, leaving the princess with but one handmaiden. That was their explanation for how she got away with this. I'm very cynical about the Midrash. Some students of the Jewish Midrash are almost disciples of it. I'm not, because of things like this. And I can't imagine that the angel Gabriel came down and did this because a rabbi says it. I mean, if the Bible says it, I'll take that. Okay, well, when Jochebed in the Hebrew, brings the weaned child to Pharaoh's daughter, we finally learn what he'll be called, what his name is going to be. And it's Moshe, or Moses, suggesting this idea of drawing out from the water. So his father was Amram, a son of Levi, and he is seen in the story very similar to some of the other ancient stories, like Cyrus, for example, who came from as an abandoned child, King Cyrus of the Persians, Romulus and Remus story in Rome, mythology and all. You remember these stories where the abandoned child becomes the national hero. And you're reminded of that. Did he have another name? What was he called by his mother before she turned him over to Pharaoh's daughter? Some think the she namer of Moses in the text is Jochebed, the mother. That Jochebed named him, and then suggested the name to Pharaoh's daughter, who liked it because of its significance. I drew him out of the water. If the she is Pharaoh's daughter, she still could have taken the suggestion and named him what his biological mother had already called him. He is only named Moses in the Bible text. Even God calls him Moses, and that's all. Moses, just Moses. So he doesn't seem to have ever had another Egyptian name. If he did, we don't know it. Okay? Stephen talks about this story, this birth story of Moses in Acts 7. At this time, Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. When he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. It's kind of interesting, the education, we are told, in Egypt focused on reading and writing. So Moses is prepared to write the Pentateuch. Maybe another little side point on who the author of the Pentateuch is, you see. Okay? Who was Pharaoh's daughter? No name is given in the Torah. Josephus calls her Thermutis or Thermutus. The Midrash traditions are unanimous on this. They call Pharaoh's daughter Bitya or Bitya, which means daughter of God. So you might want to remember that. Okay? Noble role of women in that period of time now in our story. The midwives, the mother of Moses, Miriam, the sister of Moses, the Egyptian princess, and on later Zipporah, Moses' wife. All of these women are seen honorable in the text, aren't they? As with Jesus, however, the narrative is silent on the years of Moses' upbringing. Like the Lord, there's not much on Moses in those years.